The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and welcome to the ALCTS webinar on Special Collections Cataloging Monographs. I'm Amanda Stone, a member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee. I will be your host for today's webinar. Our presenter today is Melissa Tofino, the head of Special Collections and Formats Cataloging at Rutgers University Libraries. She is responsible for acquisitions, cataloging, and metadata for rare and unique materials in all formats, as well as all music, media, and maps. She has been cataloging special collections for 14 years. Melissa brings considerable expertise to today's topic, and we are fortunate to have her with us today. A few logistics for today's presentation. All attendees are muted to prevent background noise, and we do not have interactive chat capabilities. You may, however, comment on today's presentation using Twitter. The hashtag is ALCTSCE. We do not monitor the Twitter feed, so if you have questions for the presenter, please type them into the question box on your screen. We will have time for questions and answers after the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive an email with links to the recording and presentation slides shortly after the presentation concludes. And now here's Melissa. There will be a slight delay as we change presenters.
Hello, I am Melissa Tofino, the head of Special Collections and Formats Cataloging at Rutgers University Libraries, and this is Special Collections Cataloging Part 1, Monographs. So this is part 1 of a 2-part webinar. Today we will discuss cataloging special collections, monographs, and publications. Next week on October 31st, Heather Perez from Stockton University will be discussing archival collections. This series has been developed for catalogers who don't have any experience with special collections materials, but nonetheless find themselves faced with special collections materials that need to be cataloged. So maybe you work for a public library that has a small special collection that has sat there for years waiting for the right time to be cataloged, or maybe because of downsizing you find yourself suddenly also responsible for special collections as well as your other work. Or maybe you have a pile of special collections materials in the corner of your office that you have been avoiding, which we all do. If this sounds like you, then you're in the right place. So we have 2 hashtags set up for both parts of the webinar series. The first one is spec cataloging, and the second is ALCTS. ALCTS is ALCTS's hashtag for all of the webinars. If you have any questions or comments, or you would like to discuss the topic on social media, please include these hashtags. There will be a couple of times during the webinar today when I will ask the audience to answer a poll. For those of you attending in groups, you have a decision to make. You can decide how you would like to respond, either by the most common experience in the room, or you can select one person to answer for the group. I've also included a few brief cataloging exercises that we can do together, because it's been my experience that someone can talk to me about cataloging for hours, but it won't really sink in until I've tried it myself. So that is me, in case you're wondering what I look like. A note about my cataloging philosophy: I do not catalog for other catalogers. I catalog for our users. I believe strongly that cataloging rules are there to guide us, not to restrict us. So keep that in mind. If there is a rule in DCRMB or RDA that will not aid our users in accessing or finding our material, I personally believe it's okay to ignore that rule within limits. My MLS is from Rutgers, School of Communication Information, formerly Skills, but then they dropped the library. I have 14 years experience cataloging special collections materials at Rutgers. At Rutgers, I report to the head of Central Technical Services and not Special Collections. Some places have special collections cataloging within the special collections libraries. Others do it centralized this way. So at Rutgers, I am housed with the other catalogers. Here at Rutgers, we have 5 main special collections libraries. There's the Special Collections and University Archives, the Institute of Jazz Studies, Dana Newark, which is a Newark history collection based in Dana Library in our Newark campus. The History of Medicine collection, which is mainly about the history of medicine in New Jersey. And then we also have what we call X collections throughout the university libraries. A little bit of background, let me step back a moment about Rutgers. We have 4 universities here within the state of New Jersey. So in the city of Newark, we have 2 special collections, Dana Newark, which I mentioned, and also the Institute of Jazz Studies, which is the largest jazz archive in the world. Our main special collections library, Special Collections University Archives, focuses on the history and culture of New Jersey and also the history and culture of the university. And then we have smaller special collections throughout, things like the X Griffiths collection, which is mainly books about the relationship between the United States and Japan in the 19th century. So very specialized. And I'm responsible for cataloging everything in those collections. Today, what are we going to talk about? We have 5 general areas. First, I want to explain the difference between special collections and the general collection. Then we'll talk a little bit about preservation and processing concerns, which come up more with special collections materials than with the general collection. And then we have 3 cataloging areas that we will look at: title and publication information, physical description, and copy-specific information. So we'll start with our first poll. Everyone can see the question. I would like to know, what is your comfort level with special collections cataloging? Are you A, cataloger who regularly catalogs special collections? B, a cataloger who sometimes catalogs special collections but is mainly responsible for general collections? C, a cataloger who has never cataloged special collections? D, an archivist who's mainly responsible for archival collections but has a few special collections, maybe MARC-based cataloging things to tackle? Or E, are you not a cataloger, not an archivist, brand new, totally in the woods? So I'll give everyone a minute. Oh, I'm sorry, I have to launch the poll. My apologies. So the poll has been launched. Hopefully everyone is able to answer. I see some answers coming in. Oh dear, I put the wrong poll. I'm so sorry. All right, let's do this again. Let me close this one. There we go. All right, is everyone ready? Let's try this again. My apologies for that. I was wondering why no one was answering, and everyone was probably sitting there confused. Okay, so we're at about 80% responding, and it looks like most people, well over 50%, are catalogers who sometimes catalog special collections. Following that, at 21% right now, we have a cataloger who has never cataloged special collections, 10% catalogers who regularly catalog special collections, and 6% each are either archivists or neither catalogers nor archivists. So, and here are those results. I think that's typical. Generally, most places don't have a dedicated special collections cataloger or a dedicated special collections cataloging department, but this is just part of your regular work. You have your regular general collections cataloging, and then you might get something very unique or bizarre or just really interesting and different that someone donates that you have to catalog, that you have to tackle. And that's why we're here today. Okay, so there are 4 main differences between special collections and the general collection. These are life cycle, the life cycle of the materials themselves, collection development, how the materials came into the library and why, cataloging, how we describe them, and preservation condition concerns. I always tell everyone when I talk about my position that there's a different life cycle for special collections materials. In the general collection, books are born, they live, and they die. They're acquired usually by purchase, although sometimes through donation. They're cataloged, they're processed. Oh, I'm hearing that people can't hear me. Okay, I think it's okay. Please let the tech support know if you can't hear me, and we'll take care of it. So they're cataloged, they're processed, barcoded, stamped, tattle-taped, they're circulated, or they're used in-house, and eventually they're deaccessioned, or they're lost and not replaced. But there's a beginning and an end. Special collections materials, though, are immortal. They're acquired, possibly more often through donation than purchase. They're cataloged, processed, stored. They're generally used in-house and not circulated. Sometimes they go into exhibits. Sometimes they're digitized. And this goes on endlessly. We receive these materials with the expectations that they will be a permanent part of the library's collection. When I hand write a call number on the title page of a special collections book, which I'll talk about in a little bit, I know that my handwriting will stay on that book, and that book will stay in the collection for generations after I am gone. And that is true whether it's something that currently holds value, such as an autographed item or an item that is already old or unique or valuable, or also ephemeral or mass-marketed material that will eventually gain value. The collection development of special collections materials is different. Most special collections materials are not purchased but are acquired through donation. My colleagues who catalog general collection materials are mainly working with items that have been ordered through our acquisitions vendor. But donations are the bread and butter of special collections. About 75% of what I catalog has been donated. Of the remaining 25% that is purchased, about 20% comes from small independent vendors like antiquarian bookshops. The general collection follows a patron-driven or curriculum-driven model. Items are purchased because the patrons or the curriculum demands them. Special collections materials are acquired because they fit the scope of the collection. At Rutgers, we have several special collections, as I discussed. We also have a rare book collection, the focus of which is not on the content of the books, but on the books themselves. Books in this collection must meet specific criteria, and I've included the link there if anyone would like to view it later. But generally, if a book is printed before a certain date in a certain part of the world, it classifies as rare. Often people will bring me books that they would like to relocate to special collections just because they're old. And this is ultimately up to the special collections librarian, not me as the cataloger. So I will bring that to them for review. But unfortunately, if the books do not meet our established criteria, the special collections library will not accept them. So just because it's old doesn't mean necessarily that it's rare. But in reality, you may also acquire materials that do not fit any established collections. You may work for an institution that does not have a special collection library, but nonetheless, you have acquired rare, unique, or just downright quirky material. In any case, these materials still require specialized treatment. So once you have these materials, and you either do or don't know why you have them, but you have them and you have to face them, you have to figure out how you're going to catalog them. And I think this can be daunting for a lot of people who don't regularly catalog special collections. There are some cataloging differences. So in addition to RDA and AACR2, special collections catalogers follow the descriptive cataloging of rare materials, which is split into various guides by format. What I'll talk about a little bit today is the descriptive cataloging of rare materials books. This is available online as a free PDF and also on the cataloger's desktop. When we start talking about cataloging, I'm not going to give an in-depth overview of DCRMB. This webinar is more of a practical how-to so that you can leave here and get the special collections materials that you have off your desk. But DCRB is available online for free, so I encourage you to review it when you can. So DCRMB has what they call the functional objectives of descriptive cataloging of rare materials, books, which is what you're trying to accomplish when you catalog these materials. I'm just going to paraphrase them for you. So basically, from a catalog record, from the record you bring up on OCLC, the user must be able to distinguish clearly between different copies of an item, identify and select an item without direct access to it, investigate the context of the item and the provenance of the item, the story of how the item came to be and everything that happened to it after it was created. The idea is to give the user here as much information as possible in the record itself, so they don't have to waste their time traveling a distance to review the item. In special collections, at least at Rutgers, I'm sure it's true everywhere, our users come to us internationally. We have people traveling to see our collections from Asia, from Europe, from all over the United States, from Canada, from South America. If the users can answer their question, can get as much of their research done as possible by looking at the record in WorldCat, all the better. General collections items are also usually just about the text, the information contained within the item. It doesn't matter if two books with the same text have different bindings, but a special collections scholar is very interested in the variations between two seemingly identical copies. On a practical side of things, though, things can be a little different. To paraphrase the practical rules that you should be following when you're cataloging special collections, record everything, but record everything within your means and within your institution's means. Put as much information in there as you can, but I doubt any of us has the time to spend a week on a single record. So at some point you have to know when to stop. Embrace variance. If you have two slightly different copies of the same book, that information will need to be recorded. But use common sense. Always ask yourself, is the metadata I'm adding to this record going to be useful to my users? And sometimes it might be useful to other catalogers too, but as long as it's being used. Assume you know nothing. It's very easy to look at some of this material and guess, but make sure you really are basing your guess on something. This will be more clear as we start talking about dates. Don't be scared. I know the tendency is to take some of this material and put it aside, but you don't have to. It's not as daunting as it looks. And have fun. This is the most fun you will ever have cataloging. The special collections items are fascinating. I personally feel very lucky for getting the opportunity to work with them. Okay, now it's time for a question. This is an open-ended question. So I would like to know, if we could just take a moment, what is the weirdest or most interesting or most awe-inspiring thing that has ever come across your desk? And I think what we're going to do is if you can type your answer into the questions tab, maybe Tech support can tell me if I have that wrong. Okay, I'm hearing that the questions tab is fine. Okay, so someone said they cataloged a drafting table, 16th century rare book or artist book in the fan format. Oh, artist books. My former institution's zines collection, a manuscript in Latin. Oh, this is a good one. An artist book in a lunchbox with a thermos. A 50-year-old hamburger, a bottle of beer. These are fascinating. The lunchbox was part of the book. Okay. A cereal that was a piece of glass. So one thing I'm thinking of as I'm reading these, sometimes the librarians and special collections that I work with will bring me something and say, can you catalog this? And my answer is always, I can catalog a cereal box if you give it to me. And that really isn't that far off from some of these. Okay. So a copy of a donor's gift book about the history of a Serbian university in Serbian and English. Languages are more of a problem in special collections. I mean, you sort of have to relax and just try your best with languages that you're not familiar with. Okay, I'm going to move on. But thank you for all your answers. Okay, going back over here. Okay, the ugly side of special collections, preservation and condition concerns. So special collections books may be in fragile condition when they come to you. Sometimes they're in fragile condition just by chance of being in the special collections library, and sometimes maybe breaking your collection development policy if you have one. Books in fragile condition are just sent to special collections because they're too delicate to circulate. Some examples of physical condition concerns are brittle pages, loose or broken spines, dust and rust, mold, and pest infestation. Brittle pages is probably the most common that I see. And we should all know that the whole 19th century is just crumbling in our fingertips. Loose and broken spines, not as much of a problem if the materials aren't circulating. Dust and rust, I learned early on not to wear my best clothing to work here. I do go home dirty quite a bit. Mold is a bigger concern for people, and pest infestation, hopefully by the time the materials have gotten to you, the pests have left and have just left, you know, their little bite marks and stories that they've left behind. But how do we handle this material? Some of these rules, and it's a lot of rules, are to protect us from the books, and some of them are to protect the books from us. So going through them pretty quickly, no drinks or food in your work area, because for one thing, you can spill. You also could invite pests to the materials. We don't want that. Please wash your hands before working with the material so that you are not transferring your own dirt and germs to the material, but then wash them after you're done so that you're not bringing any of that home. Store books flat with nothing on top of them when possible, or straight upright. Don't leave them leaning or hanging off the side of a shelf or table, and store nothing on the floor if possible. It drives me crazy when I walk into a library and I see all the books on a shelf leaning like they've fallen asleep. So I've sort of made it an unconscious habit to always push them up, because you will break the spines that way. You can use a beanbag or another light object to hold a book open during cataloging. I have a colleague who has little toys that she uses. Do not lick your fingers when turning pages. Here's a picture of what we do at Rutgers. These are the bean bags that we use to hold the book open. The book is also in a cradle. Use only pencil when working with special collections materials, and that should also be true for your patrons. If you are not able to identify mold or pests, please turn to a colleague who can and err on the side of caution. People are always bringing me books and asking me if they're moldy, which I do not mind. I'm very happy when they do. So it's always fine to ask. Please do not carry more than 1 or 2 books at a time. Use a truck because it's very easy to drop them. And this is something that I am very guilty of breaking myself, but maybe breaking the rule myself. But please remember, if you can, put everything on a truck. Now, white gloves. White gloves can be worn when handling special collections materials, but be careful because they can make handling of the item more awkward, causing damage through rips or tears. Clean, dry hands are generally best. Processing. The idea here is to keep the item in the state in which it comes to you. So retain dust jackets and consider them part of the publication. Please consider skipping the barcodes, the labels, and tattle tape if possible. Use acid-free strips for call number information and barcodes. And that's what I have in this picture here. What we do at Rutgers, the barcode goes on the bottom of the strip and the call number information is handwritten at the top. Use acid-free envelopes to house thin items that cannot stand up on their own on the shelf. That's this. And what we do, we put the barcode in the bottom right-hand corner, call number information goes in the upper left-hand corner, and we handwrite the title at the top. Sort of a funny story, we used to have students who would use a typewriter to put this information on the envelopes, but then we stopped getting students who could use a typewriter, so we moved to handwriting them. You could also print these out on a computer. I have a very tricky printer that breaks easily, so I like to handwrite them. So we handwrite the call number and accession number if there's an accession number, also inside the book. You can see that here. So the title page verso is ideal as long as it can be done without damaging the book. In this case, this book was brittle, it was very delicate. I was worried about handwriting this information on the title page verso, so I just wrote it on the title page itself. The reason we prefer not to write it on the title page is because of exhibitions. So if this book is ever used in an exhibit, we want it to be neat and pretty. But sometimes that's just the easiest way to do it. Okay, poll time. Hopefully I'll get this one right. So the question will be, what should you not do if given a moldy book to catalog? A, wrap it in plastic. B, isolate it from other books. C, catalog it, adding a note about the mold and then send it to the collection. D, send for mold remediation. Or E, throw it in the trash. So 4 of these are right, 1 is wrong. And now let me see if I am tech savvy enough to get this poll working. Launch. Okay, that should be good now. So there's one thing you should not be doing. Okay. I'm so eager to see what everyone says. I can imagine debates going on in the groups where people signed up as a group. Okay, we're at about 80%. I have, let me close it now and share. Everyone see? So 1% said isolate it from other books. No one said send it for mold remediation. I guess that was a little obvious. 5% said wrap it in plastic. 41% said throw it in the trash. And 52% said catalog it, adding a note about the mold and send it to the collection. So 52% of you got it right. Yay! So wrapping it in plastic is actually a good idea because the plastic will contain the mold. You do want to isolate it from other books, isolating it not only from other books in the collection, but also from other books in your work area. If you can send it for mold remediation, that's great. If you can't treat it, then unfortunately you will have to throw it in the trash because mold will spread. It will spread through the air. Dormant mold will grow again if given the right conditions. What you never ever want to do is send it back to the collection because it will spread. So C is the one that you do not do. Do not catalog it, adding a note about the mold and send it to the collection because then you risk infecting your whole collection with mold. Okay, we are on to cataloging standards. But before we start talking about cataloging, a note about RDA. I took this quote directly from the Rare Books and Manuscripts section website on October 1st. As of October 1st, the Bibliographic Standards Committee is neutral regarding RDA, neither encouraging nor discouraging agencies regarding implementation of RDA acceptable DCRM records. Until the RBMS policy statements to RDA are complete, agencies creating DCRM records should proceed as follows. Either number 1, catalog according to DCRMB and AACR2 for descriptive cataloging, using RDA guidelines for access points, or create RDA records by applying the provisions for rare materials included in the RDA BibCo standard BSR. If this option is used throughout the entire description and code as following ISBD with both RDA in the delimiter E and DCRMB in the delimiter E in the 040 field. What this basically means is that special collections catalogers, rare books catalogers have not fully embraced RDA, which is nice because we aren't held to RDA guidelines in the same way that general collections catalogers are. I'm very grateful for that because some of the RDA rules are not as straightforward as AACR2 and can be difficult to apply to specialized materials. So as I said earlier, we catalog to the user, not to the rules. Okay, starting with the title. What we want to do is always transcribe the title exactly as it appears. And again, what I'm giving you now is sort of a summary of what is in DCRMB. If you want to see the full rules, I really encourage you to go to DCRMB online and review it. But we transcribe it exactly as it appears. Normalization for capitalization is okay. The example given, if we have the New Hampshire and Vermont Almanac, New Hampshire, all one word there, we will transcribe it in the 245 as New Hampshire, all one word, and Vermont Almanac. But we can change the capitalized almanac to lowercase. You should also transcribe misprints as they appear in the publications, but follow by sic in brackets or IE and the correction in square brackets. So for example, of the knowledge which maketh a wise man, we don't correct the spelling of knowledge. And the noted, i.e. noted, history of Mother Grimm. The same thing with the word noted. We don't correct the spelling. Sometimes you will have something that doesn't have a title, which is not a problem. You need to first check for the title page, of course, check for the cover, check for any place where you could find a title that would make sense to the user, and if there isn't one, you get to make one up. Not from thin air, but something that will aid the user in finding this item. The title should then go in brackets unless you are cataloging a manuscript. in which case it is assumed that there is no title page and the brackets are not required. It's generally known that all titles for manuscripts are supplied by the cataloger. In publications, though, you would put the title in brackets and add a note, title supplied by cataloger, and that's just a 500 note. So the example given here, this is something I cataloged in the 245. I had Joseph Ishel Oriel Press items. This was a collection of 8 specimens, really, of different typeface and graphic images that we kept together. It wasn't large enough to be an archival collection. It was just 8 pieces. So I gave it the supplied title, Joseph Ishel Oriel Press items, title supplied by cataloger. Publication information, same idea. You record it exactly as it appears on the item. If you have to omit something just because the publication information is very long, then you would do so with ... I don't have an example of that here, but I'm sure we've all seen it. So 264, New York with the hyphen, printed and published by S. Gould, 1807. You wouldn't remove the hyphen from New York. And you include the printed and published by in the delimiter B. And you also transcribe the place of publication exactly as it appears on the item. So if your book says Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Boston, that's how you copy it, not Boston, Massachusetts. More on publication information, supply correct names and fuller forms of place names in a note. So in the 260 or 264, you are recording the information exactly as it appears in the item, and then you can clarify or correct it in a 500 note. So for example, 500 actually published in Paris, if the publisher, if you knew the publication information was wrong, or in a 500 published in Buenos Aires. If the place of publication is fictitious, supply it nonetheless and make an explanatory note. If the actual place is known or can be surmised, supply it in brackets. So if you have a book that says it was published in Metropolis, in a 500 note you would say it was actually published in New York. If privately printed appears on the item, transcribe it in the publication statement. So in the example, Newark, New Jersey, privately printed, 2016. Dates. This is where it gets to be a lot of fun. You are not always going to have a date, in which case you estimate within reasonable means. A printing date can serve as a publication date that has to be supplied in brackets. In the fixed fields, if you're unsure of a date, you can say 19UU if you know it was 1900s, 198U if you know it was the 1980s, etc. In your 260 or 264, you would say approximately 1900, or between 1900 and 1999, between 1980 and 1989, or 1989 with a question mark. If a date is found somewhere in the item aside from the title page or colophon, please do a service to the next cataloger by adding a note. So you would say in a 500 note, date from preface, or if you were using a reference source, you would list that there. Dates are when you get to do a little bit of research and sort of play at being a sleuth. You need to find a date if you can, or to get somewhat close to the actual date of publication. And this is where you need to do some research. I have determined the date of an item based on the cars that are in photos, based on the phone numbers in ads at the back. If something says, for more information, call Mulberry 2577, then I can figure out generally when this item was produced. And I've even found dates based on the mention of sliced bread. Sliced bread was invented in 1928, in case you were wondering. I had an item where I couldn't place a date, but they mentioned in a recipe to use sliced bread. And I thought the fact that they're mentioning that specifically means that's not a common thing yet. And so I got the date down to circa 1928. You can also use names of people mentioned, or institutions or corporations mentioned, or historic events. This is when Google comes in handy. Do your best within reason. Okay, I did include exercises. Maybe we can rush through them a little quickly because I think I might be running short on time. But I have a picture of a title page here. And if you would like to, back at your places, try cataloging this book. So in the 245, we have quite a long title. And you can use either the 260 or the 264. But what we have here is New York with a hyphen, printed and published for the author, blah, 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 1804. I'll give you a minute. Okay. And this is how this was cataloged in our catalog. So even though that title is long, we would include the whole thing. In our 260, New York has the hyphen, and we mentioned that it was printed and published for the author by G and R Waite. And we actually omitted all this information in the publisher statement, but we didn't have to. We could have included all of that in the 260. This is a case where it's cataloger's judgment, how much time you have, how many the resources you have at your disposal. Both are correct. Physical description. The pagination on these items is going to be a little different. So sometimes you will have an item without page numbers or with various page numbers. It could start going 1 through 20 and then 1A through 25A and so on. It's okay to just use one volume unpaged in the 300 or one volume various pagings if that applies. It is preferred to count the pages and add them in brackets. So you would say 25 pages in brackets, but you have to decide this based on your means. It would take a lot of time to count 200 pages in a book. I don't think anyone has time to do that. This is a case where one volume unpaged is okay. If you have an incomplete book, so if you're missing pages, you can say in the second bullet point, 179 pages, parentheses, incomplete. Or you could also say 89 to 213 if that's the portion you have in front of you. You can also estimate unnumbered pages, so approximately 200 pages or 200 unnumbered pages. One thing you should do is record all plates and count them if necessary. So 250 pages, also 11 unnumbered pages of plates. If they're folded, then you would record that in parentheses, some folded. The reason it's important to count illustrations and maps, plates, is because these are special collections books, they're unique materials. It's important to a scholar to know that you have the illustrations that they may have read about in another source. It's also a good theft prevention tool in case these plates walk. You can have a record in the catalog saying that you had those 11 pages of plates. In any case, it's more important to record the numbers of unnumbered plates or illustrations than unnumbered pages overall. This is one of my most favorite things I cataloged. In the picture here, it was from Atlantic City. I think it was the early 1900s. This was one long folded panel of 22 photographs of Atlantic City, and they folded up into a seashell. This was an example of a single sheet publication, which I come across a lot. So for a publication consisting of a single sheet folded into multiple panels, you would include in parentheses a count of the number of physical panels on one side of the sheet when unfolded, which is this illustration here. Provide details of the sheet's layout in a note. So what I did in the 300 field, one folded sheet, 22 panels, and they were unnumbered, so I put them in brackets. In my 500 note, I said a folded sheet of 22 panels on each side when unfolded. All panels are unnumbered. And then I also added a 500 note about the unusual binding or cover. I said all tipped in two halves of a seashell bound together with cloth ribbon. So real quick, if you want to try your hand at cataloging this book, just the 300 and 500 field. What we had here, and this is something on my desk currently, is one book. It was 16 pages, 22 centimeters, with a map tipped in at the end, which just means it was glued in. The title of the map was Cape May Roads. And here's a situation where I broke my own rule. I had to put this on my floor because my table was not big enough. And this is what I did. 16 pages, one folded map, 22 centimeters. One map tipped in at end, colon, Cape May Roads. Okay, local notes and copy-specific information. This is where we talk about the 500 versus the 590 note. The 500 note is a general note, and what you should ask yourself is, does this note apply to every instance of this publication? If yes, then you would use a 500 note. A 590, on the other hand, is a local note. So you would ask yourself, does this note apply to every instance of this publication? If no, then you would use a 590. 500 notes can go to OCLC, 590 notes cannot go to OCLC. Sometimes you will see them anyway, but they really shouldn't be there because they're specific to the individual institution. Some institutions use public display holding notes instead of 590s. That depends on your system. This is another interesting thing I cataloged. This was in the Institute of Jazz Studies. It was a regular book about jazz from the early 20th century, and I opened it up to see in bright green Louis Armstrong's signature, and then the signatures of basically every big name from jazz you could think of from the early 20th century. And the story behind it was the book was owned by a journalist who went to all these jazz shows in New York and would have whoever was playing that night sign his book. So he ended up with this amazing book that was signed by everyone. And this was something that no one knew they had. They knew they had the book, but it wasn't until I opened it up to catalog it that I discovered this. This was a case for a local 590 note. And what you would say is signed in ink, well, not by author in this case, but signed in ink by, and I listed the names of everyone who signed it. 590 notes, they're used for situations like this, when a book is autographed. They're also used for imperfections, anything that would only apply to the book itself, to the object itself. So for imperfect copies, you would say something like special collections copy imperfect, leaves 3 to 11 wanting. Wanting just means missing. I have had some librarians give me pushback about that. They would rather use the word missing, but the generally accepted term is wanting. For inscribed or signed copies, you would say special collections copy signed in ink by the author. Special collections there is just what we call our special collections library, but you can insert your own library's name in there. Other examples of local notes and copy-specific information would include limited printings. I have an illustration of that here. So on the book, you would see something like, this is copy number 11 of 350 copies printed. And the way you handle this is with a 500 note that says 350 copies printed and a 590 note saying special collections copy, number 11. The reason you're splitting it there is because the 350 copies printed, that applies to every instance of the work. But the fact that this is copy number 11, that's specific to our own copy. The example here, you have first edition, first printing, copy number 35. So the copy number 35 would be 590. This, of course, would be 250, but that's the difference there. And if you want to try cataloging this book, it's pretty straightforward. You have two 590 notes. This is a case where the book is inscribed and not autographed because it is inscribed to someone. This was inscribed to Joan Snyder, who is the artist that this exhibition catalog was about, signed by the woman who wrote the essay in the exhibition catalog. That would be one 590 note. The second 590 note would say that it was the gift of Barbara Mensch. And I'm just going to jump ahead to the answers since we're pressed for time. So my first note, special collections copy, inscribed to Joan Snyder by Jenny Sorky. And my second 590, special collections copy, gift of Barbara Mensch. Some helpful and interesting sources for you. There's the link again to the descriptive cataloging of rare materials. Through this link, you could get not just books, but also the other formats they cover as well. The ACRL Rare Books and Manuscripts section website, rbms.info, and the history of the book from UCLA. I could talk about this all day, and I'm sorry for going over my time, but if anyone has questions.
Hi, Melissa. Thank you. This has been a really interesting session, and we do have some questions that I'd like to be able to get to. The first question was sort of backwards. Did you have to verify the autographs to make sure they were authentic in that Louis Armstrong book?
Yes. So I'm very fortunate at Rutgers. In the Jazz Institute, I have experts on hand who I could bring the book to, and that's how I got the story about the journalist who brought this book all over to every jazz club in New York. But they were able to verify that the signatures were real. Sometimes it's hard to tell if this is actually something that was signed or if it was printed with a picture of a signature. And I have been tricked before. Shortly after I found that book, I had an LP that I thought was signed by Quincy Jones. And I brought it back to the same experts and said, look, I found another one. And they said, no, I'm sorry, this was printed on every LP. But yeah, if you don't have the expert in-house, it can get a little trickier. You may have to do a little more research and a little more of sort of just going with your own instincts, but also, as I mentioned earlier, assume you know nothing and question everything and make sure you really have it right. It can be a little tricky.
Okay, we had a couple questions about specific to the DCRM. Why does the DCRMB still use the AACR2 short forms for descriptions? So using the Illustrator ILL period and facsimile rather than spell it out, but they say that the DCRM manuscript spells it out.
I don't know. That's a very good question. That seems like a simple fix. I know, even though the rare book cataloging world has not embraced RDA yet, that's something that I think most of us are doing. We are spelling out illustrations because why not? It's not like...
Sure.
Yeah.
And is why is the DCRM still using the sick instead of the transcription as is with misspellings, which is what the RDA does?
Yes. So right now, RBMS is still reviewing RDA, believe it or not, and trying to apply the rules to the unique needs of rare books cataloging. So we just haven't fully embraced all of RDA yet. And I can tell you, if you ask 3 rare books catalogers about a particular RDA rule, they will apply it 3 different ways. There really just hasn't been much agreement, or nothing has really been settled yet on that.
Sure. How do you record unnumbered loose pages where some of them are folded?
Unnumbered
loose pages,
some are folded. That would be, so imagine you had 10 loose pages unnumbered. You would put the 10 in brackets. So bracket 10, close bracket, loose pages, I would say, and then in parentheses, some folded. Okay. Or you could say 10 pages in parentheses, loose, comma, some folded.
Sounds like there are lots of different ways to do it correctly. Yeah. Someone says, occasionally I see notes about mold in records. Should we include notes about molds, maybe if it's not active currently?
You could. At Rutgers, we use the 583 note, which I think is an action note for any preservation actions taken. So we had a collection that we sent out for mold remediation many years ago. And when that collection came back, and it wasn't an archival collection, it was a collection of published works. Everything in that collection got the 583 note for the mold remediation that took place, and we included the date. I don't think that displayed to the public. It was a staff note, but it is helpful to know.
So, okay, I think we have probably can do 2 more questions here. Okay. Is there any guidance out there on the phrasing of the 500 or 590 notes, or is it simply based on your institution's needs?
It's mainly based on your institution's needs. A good way of handling this is to search other institutions and see if there's some consistency there. Search OCLC if there's a library that collects the area of what you're cataloging. For example, for my music records, I go to Texas a lot because they have an excellent music library. I know it's not a great answer, but in a practical way, that's really the best way to handle it.
Well, it's not stealing, it's learning from the best.
Exactly.
And
I wish there was a standard that I could point you to, but there just isn't.
I think last question that we can get to today, if something is autographed or inscribed, why isn't it cataloged as a 590 versus a 500? Isn't that something that a scholar might be interested in?
It's cataloged as a 590 because only that individual item is affected by the inscription or the autograph. So I guess it sounds like the assumption is that the 590 doesn't display, but it should. I think in some ILSs, the 590 is suppressed. We had that at Rutgers. We discovered that our 590s were not displaying to the public, and we had to change that because it is very important information for people to see.
Sure. Okay, I want to let everybody know that we're glad you could be with us today. You will soon receive a short online evaluation. Please take a few minutes to respond to the questions. Your comments are very valuable, and it will help the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee plan for future events. The email will also include links to today's slides and recording. You will now have the opportunity to receive a certificate of attendance, and that information will also be in the email. I want to thank our presenter, Melissa Tofino, and thanks also to members of the Continuing Education Committee, Felicity Dykes, Catherine Balick, Miriam Naumberg, and to Alana Warren from the ALCTS office. The support they provide makes it possible for us to present these webinars. ALCTS has other continuing education opportunities coming up. We have several more webinars this fall, including the second Special Collections Cataloging webinar on manuscripts, a two-part introduction to data visualization, tools and skills, and one on current developments in name authorities. See the ALCTS website to register or find more information on these events. ALCTS also offers web courses, which are 4 to 6 weeks long, as well as 2-day email discussions. Our next e-forum will be on November 13th about ebook management, what works, what doesn't. Check the website for information on upcoming courses and discussions. Thank you all for joining us today, and this concludes our session.